sister-in-law set a glass of ice water on the counter in front of me and said, "You can refill these while the adults talk." She didn't look at me when she said it. She was already turning back toward the dining room, toward my brother and his business partner, and the attorney they'd flown in from Chicago, smoothing her blazer like she was about to close a deal that would change their lives. Which, in a way, she was. I picked up the pitcher. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in my brother's kitchen, the kitchen of the house I'd helped him buy, and listened to the sound of my own family, deciding I wasn't worth a seat at the table. That was March. This is what happened next. I need to explain something about my brother before any of this makes sense. My brother Derek is 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the story my parents told themselves about who they were. He was the reason they moved to the better school district. He was the reason my mother cut her hours at the hospital to drive him to travel baseball, to debate camp, to the kind of enrichment programs that cost more per summer than my entire college wardrobe. He had the grades when he tried, the charm when he needed it, and the uncanny ability to fail spectacularly and have everyone around him explain why it wasn't really his fault. My father called it resilience. My mother called it potential. What it actually was, I didn't have a word for until I was 26 years old and sitting in a continuing education seminar on behavioral economics. And the instructor wrote 2 words on the whiteboard: sunk cost. That's what Derek was. He was money already spent. And my parents would not stop throwing good money after bad, because stopping would mean looking at 30 years of choices and admitting they'd made a mistake. I was the other kind of investment, the boring kind, the kind that shows up in your portfolio and never does anything exciting, and you forget you even have it until the market crashes and it turns out to be the only thing still standing. I put myself through school. I graduated with a degree in finance and a second in real estate law, neither of which impressed my father, who wanted me to go pre-med, like Derek had briefly claimed he would, before switching majors twice and eventually getting a communications degree he's never used. I got a job at a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta. I got promoted. I got promoted again. 3 years ago, I moved into acquisitions, distressed commercial property mostly, hotels that were hemorrhaging cash, retail strips that lost their anchor tenants, small mixed-use buildings that went sideways when their owners ran out of runway. I buy things that are broken and I fix them. Or I don't fix them and I sell the parts. Depends on the asset. My family knew none of this. Not the specifics. To my mother, I was something in real estate. To my father, I was doing okay for herself. To Derek, I was his little sister who rented an apartment and drove a sensible car and didn't have the imagination to dream bigger than a salary. That was fine with me. I had learned a long time ago that the best position in a negotiation is the one where the other side underestimates you. So let me tell you about the restaurant. Derek had been talking about the restaurant for 2 years. He'd found a space in Buckhead, one of those old brick buildings with exposed beams and good bones, the kind of space that photographs well and has concept written all over it before you've even decided what you're serving. He wanted to do upscale Southern fusion, farm to table, but not precious about it, he said. He had a chef friend who was in, a business partner named Marcus who had industry connections, and a conviction that was immune to any evidence to the contrary. The problem was money. The build-out alone was going to cost close to $400,000. Derek had maybe $30,000 in savings, which sounds like more than it is when you consider that he owed $18,000 on a truck and had a monthly nut that left him essentially liquid to the tune of whatever was in his checking account on any given Tuesday. Marcus, his partner, had fronted $50,000. A friend had kicked in $25,000. That left a gap of roughly $325,000, which Derek had spent 6 months pretending wasn't as big as it was. Then he found the solution. Or what he thought was the solution. There was a small regional investment group out of Nashville that was doing a hospitality funding round. They were specifically looking for F&B concepts in secondary Southeast markets: Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Chattanooga. Experienced operators preferred, but not required. Minimum investment pitch of $200,000 committed capital, with the group potentially matching up to 150%. Derek came to my parents with a business plan he'd had someone else write and a pitch deck he'd spent 40 minutes assembling in Canva. He needed $275,000 to close the gap between what he and Marcus had raised and what he needed to show the investment group as committed capital. My parents did not have $275,000 in cash, but my father had a rental property in Smyrna that he'd owned outright for 12 years, and the equity in that property was just over $310,000 based on a recent appraisal. Derek had an attorney, a friend of Marcus's. Not a real estate attorney, not a transactional attorney, just a guy who passed the bar and did mostly traffic tickets and wills, who had drafted paperwork for my father to take out a HELOC against the Smyrna property to fund Derek's restaurant vision. My father called me 3 weeks before the closing, not to ask my opinion, to tell me about it. "There's a difference. Your brother's got a real shot at something here," he said. "We're putting him behind him." I asked if he'd had anyone look at the investment group structure. He said Derek had done his research. I asked if he'd had a real estate attorney review the HELOC terms. He said the attorney Marcus knew had looked it over. I said, "Dad, Marcus's attorney is a guy who does DOIs. There was a pause. Then my father said, "Your brother doesn't need you second-guessing him. He needs support." I almost said it then. I almost told him what I'd been sitting on for 2 weeks since my own team flagged the Nashville group in a routine market scan. But I thought about the way my father's voice sounded when he talked about Derek's potential. I thought about my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, when Derek gave a toast that went on for 11 minutes, and my father cried, and I sat there in a bridesmaid dress thinking, I paid off my student loans last month and no one said a word. I didn't say anything. I told my father I hoped it worked out, and then I made a call to my acquisitions director and told her I wanted to look at everything we had on the Nashville group. What we found was not surprising, but it was thorough. The group was called Pinnacle Hospitality Ventures. It had been operating for 4 years and had funded 6 restaurant projects, 3 of which had closed within 18 months of opening. The remaining 3 were technically open but operating at significant losses. The fund structure had a fee layer that was unusual, a 3% origination fee on committed capital, a 12% annual management fee, and a performance clause that allowed the fund to dilute founder equity by up to 40% if certain revenue milestones weren't hit by month 18. The milestones were calibrated in a way that almost no restaurant concept could realistically achieve in that window. It wasn't technically a fraud. It was something almost worse, a legal mechanism for extracting money from optimistic people with limited transactional experience. They weren't stealing. They were just designing a structure where the math only ever worked in their favor. Derek didn't know any of this. He saw a pitch deck with pictures of successful restaurants and a term sheet with a lot of words that sounded like upside. I had 2 options. I could call my brother and walk him through what I'd found, or I could do something else. I thought about the kitchen, the ice water, the way my sister-in-law had said, the adults. I thought about how, 6 years ago, I had found a buyer from my parents' house when they needed to downsize, negotiated the sale, coordinated the closing, and my father had thanked my brother for helping with the paperwork, even though Derek had done exactly nothing. I thought about the time I asked my mother if she could help me move into my first apartment, and she said she was tired, and then 2 weeks later, she drove 4 hours to help Derek pack up after a breakup. I didn't call my brother. Instead, I called my attorney and told her I wanted to acquire a controlling interest in Pinnacle Hospitality Ventures. It took 11 days. The fund was structured as an LLC with 4 partners, 2 of whom were passive and had been looking for an exit for over a year. Their combined interest was 54%. I bought it through a holding company I'd set up for acquisitions, a Delaware LLC called Vantage Point Commercial Holdings. My name appeared nowhere in the public documents. To anyone looking, Vantage Point was an institutional buyer doing a quiet portfolio restructure. I paid $380,000 for the controlling interest, which sounds like a lot until you consider that I was about to prevent my father from losing his only investment property to a fund that had been designed to absorb his money and give him back a minority stake in a restaurant that would almost certainly fail within 2 years. 2 days after closing, I was on a call with the fund's managing partner, A man named Harrison who wore his confidence the way some people wear cologne too much, all the time. I told him there were going to be some operational changes. I told him the Atlanta pitch meeting that was already scheduled was going to proceed as planned. I told him his role in that meeting was to perform exactly as he normally would, with one addition: if a prospective investor's capital documents raised any red flags, I wanted to know before anything was countersigned. Harrison asked who I was. I told him I was the majority owner. I told him to clear his schedule for the Atlanta meeting. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. The meeting was at Derek's prospective restaurant space, the Buckhead building with the good bones and the exposed beans. Derek had reserved it for the day, set up a folding table with a white cloth and a presentation screen, and had his chef friend there to talk through the menu concept. My sister-in-law was there in a blazer she'd bought for the occasion. My father was there in the suit he wore to my grandmother's funeral. My mother sat in the back with her hands folded like she was at church. I was there because Derek had told my parents to bring the family. For energy, he'd said. For support. So I drove up from my office. I wore a dress I'd had for 3 years, and flats I'd bought on sale. I brought nothing. I carried nothing. I sat in the back next to my mother and watched my brother work the room, and thought, he really is good at this part. I'll give him that. He can make a room feel like something is about to happen. Harrison arrived with a woman from his team I hadn't met, professional, quiet, carrying a leather portfolio. He shook Derek's hand and said he was excited about the concept. He shook Marcus's hand and said he was excited about the concept. He nodded to my father. He looked at me for a moment in that way people do when they're trying to figure out why someone is in a room. I smiled and looked at the floor. My sister-in-law materialized at my elbow. Can you grab waters from the cooler in the back? We forgot to put them out. She was already walking away before she finished the sentence. I got up. I walked to the back of the space. I found the cooler, pulled out the bottles of water, and carried them to the table. I set one in front of Harrison. I set one in front of the woman from his team. I set one in front of Marcus. I put one in front of Derek. I put the last one in front of my father. My sister-in-law raised an eyebrow at me from across the room. I had not gotten one for her. I went back to my seat. Harrison opened his portfolio. He went through the fund's overview, the structure, the history, the performance of the portfolio. He was good. He was smooth. He knew which numbers to leave with and which ones to bury. I watched my father leaning forward, elbows on knees, doing the thing he always did when he believed in something, nodding, slightly before the sentence was even finished. Then Harrison asked Derek to walk through the capital commitment. Derek reached into his briefcase and produced a folder. Inside was a summary of committed capital. Marcus's $50,000, the friend's $25,000, and a bank document showing my father's HELOC approval for $275,000, bringing the total committed to just over $350,000. Harrison's team member reached for the folder. She opened it. She looked at the bank document. She looked at it for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Could we get a copy of this digitally? She asked. Our compliance system requires a direct upload from the issuing institution. It's a new requirement, SEC guidance from last quarter. Derek nodded immediately, too quickly. Of course. Specifically, we need the statement forwarded directly from your bank's document portal, she said. Can you log in and pull it from there? We can pull it up on the screen. The room had a large monitor on the wall. Derek had brought it for the pitch deck. It was still connected to a laptop. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Here is what I knew, and what no one else in the room knew. The bank document in that folder was not the actual HELOC approval letter. My father had received a preliminary approval, but the final commitment letter had come with conditions, an updated appraisal of the Smyrna property, and a title search that hadn't been resolved yet. Derek had taken the preliminary letter, scanned it, and edited out the conditional language. The letter in the folder said approved. The real letter said conditionally approved, pending further documentation. It wasn't a federal crime. It was just a lie. But it was a lie about a document to secure a financial commitment And depending on how the next 60 seconds went, it might become something more than that. Derek said, "The document is right there. Can't you just use the hard copy?" "I'm sorry," the woman said pleasantly. "It's a compliance requirement. We can't accept hard copies for the capital verification step. If you can log into your bank portal, we can pull it up directly." Derek looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the table. My father looked at Derek. And in that moment, in that specific, terrible moment, I watched my father understand that something was wrong. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Like a light going off in a room you weren't sure anyone was still in. Derek cleared his throat. "I'd have to call the bank directly. It might take a few days to get the right document. We do have another group coming in Thursday," Harrison said, not unkindly. He checked his phone. "If you need more time to get the documentation in order, that's completely fine. We just can't hold the round open indefinitely." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in a building full of exposed beams. I stood up. Everyone looked at me. "Actually," I said, "I don't think that's going to be necessary." I walked to the front of the room. My sister-in-law looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that had spontaneously started talking. My mother looked confused. My father looked, I don't know. I couldn't read it yet. I plugged my phone into the monitor. Derek started to say something. I held up one finger. "Just a second." I pulled up 3 documents. I put the first one on the screen. "This is the certificate of membership transfer for Vantage Point Commercial Holdings, dated 11 days ago. I let them read it. Vantage Point acquired controlling interest in Pinnacle Hospitality Ventures. 54%, Harrison reports to me. The meeting today has been proceeding with my knowledge and at my direction." The room was completely still. I put the second document on the screen. "This is the actual HELOC commitment letter from Dad's bank, the one with the conditional language that didn't make it into Derek's folder. The property hasn't cleared title review yet, which means the $275,000 doesn't exist as committed capital. It's a preliminary approval with 2 outstanding conditions." Derek's jaw moved, but nothing came out. I looked at my father. "I'm not saying this to humiliate anyone. I'm saying it because if this had gone forward, you would have signed a commitment based on a document that misrepresented your actual financing status, and that creates legal exposure for you. Not for Derek. For you." My father looked at the screen. He looked at Derek. He looked at the screen again. My sister-in-law said very quietly, "This isn't your business." "Dad's retirement property is my business," I said. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to, because when it's gone, he's going to need somewhere to go. I put the third document on the screen. "This is Pinnacle's fund structure. Full version, not the pitch deck version." I walked through the fee schedule. I walked through the equity dilution clause. I walked through the revenue milestones. It took about 4 minutes. By the end, even Marcus was staring at the table. "This fund," I said, "is not designed for investors to make money. It's designed to extract capital from founders and leave them with a minority stake in a business they can't afford to operate past the first year and a half." Harrison sat very still. We had talked about this. He knew I wasn't coming after him personally. I was restructuring the fund, not burning it down. But he also knew that his role in this room was to let me work. Derek stood up. "You had no right." "I had every right," I said. "I bought it." "You." He stopped. He looked at my father. "Did you know about this?" My father shook his head slowly. His hands were on his knees. They weren't shaking exactly, but they weren't still either. "Derek," I said. "Sit down." He sat down. I don't think he meant to. I think his legs just did it. I looked at my father. "The HELOC is not closed. The commitment letter has conditions that haven't been met. That means you can walk away from this right now, and nothing happens to the Smyrna property. Nothing. It stays yours." My father looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Derek. Derek was staring at the floor. "The fund is being restructured," I said. "New management fee. No equity dilution clause. Realistic performance targets. If Derek wants to apply for funding under the new terms, that option will exist. But the preliminary capital documentation will need to be accurate, and the HELOC will need to be fully executed before any commitment letter is signed. I unplugged my phone from the monitor. I'm not trying to take anything from you, I said to Derek. I'm trying to stop you from losing something you haven't even earned yet. My sister-in-law laughed. It wasn't a funny laugh. You've been planning this. I've been working, I said. There's a difference, my mother said from the back of the room in a voice I hadn't heard from her in a long time, very quiet, almost uncertain. How long have you been doing this? The acquisitions. 5 years, I said. She looked at me like she was seeing something she'd missed in a picture she'd been looking at for 30 years. Marcus stood up and said he had to make a call. He left and didn't come back. Harrison and his team member quietly gathered their things and excused themselves. The chef friend, who had not said a single word since I stood up, slipped out behind them. The room was just us. My family in a building with good bones and a white tablecloth and the wreckage of a plan. My father said, "The Smyrna property is fine," I said. "The HELOC is unexecuted. Call the bank Monday and withdraw the application." He nodded. He kept nodding for a moment after he'd processed it, the way people do when they're catching up to something. Derek looked up. His face had gone through several things in the last 10 minutes, and what it had settled on was something I recognized. Not anger, exactly, but the specific expression of someone who is trying to decide which version of events makes them look least like the person they actually are. "You should have told me," he said. "I did try," I said. "I asked Dad to have an attorney look at the fund documents. He told me you'd done your research." Derek looked at my father. My father didn't say anything. "You could have come to me directly," Derek said. "You would have talked me out of it," I said. "Or you would have gone around me. You've done both before." He didn't argue with that, which told me everything. My sister-in-law was gathering her things. She picked up her blazer off the back of a chair. She looked at me and said nothing, which was the most honest thing she'd communicated all day. I looked at my father. The offer I'd have made to any owner of a distressed asset applies here, too. If you want help thinking through what to do with the Smyrna property, whether to hold it, sell it, pull equity for something else, I'm available. That's what I do. My father looked at me for a long time. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know," I said. "That's on both of us." It was an absolution. I wasn't ready to give that, and he wasn't ready to ask for it. But it was something. A small door left open in a room that had been sealed for a long time. I picked up my bag. I said goodbye to my mother, who hugged me in a way that felt like an apology she didn't have the words for. I told her I'd call her that week. I didn't say anything to Derek on the way out. There wasn't anything to say that the room hadn't already said better. I walked out into the late afternoon, into the thick Atlanta heat that hits you like a wall when you've been inside too long. I got in my car. I turned on the air conditioning. I sat there for a minute in the quiet. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Marcus. It said, "How did you know about the documents?" I put my phone in my bag and drove home. Some things are not worth explaining to people who only want to know so they can find the workaround. The Smyrna property is still my father's. He withdrew the HELOC application the following Monday. Derek and the restaurant concept are, as far as I know, still looking for funding through other channels. He hasn't called me. I haven't called him. My father called me 3 weeks later. He didn't bring up the meeting directly. He asked about work. I told him a little about the fund restructuring. He listened in a way he hadn't before. Not politely, but actually, like someone taking notes. Before he hung up, he said, "I didn't realize." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I should have." I said, "Yeah." There wasn't much else to say after that. But I think we both understood that the conversation had happened and that it counted. That's enough. For now, that's enough.